Welcome, everyone. This is Director of Legal Affairs and Public Policy for the Oregon Realtors, and I want to welcome you today to our webinar on climate-friendly and equitable communities. And we subtitled this webinar the biggest change to land because that's probably what it is. In 2020, Governor Brown issued an executive order asking all of her state agencies to examine and do rulemaking on what they could do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. As a result of that executive order, the Department of Land Conservation and Development and the Department of Transportation teamed up to do a rulemaking called Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities with the goal of revamping land use and transportation planning to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Today, we are going to hear about the rules from the staff at DLCD that has been developing them. And then we are going to hear the reaction to the proposed rules from a couple of stakeholders. Matt Brinkley with the City of Medford, the planner there, will be on, and Samantha Baer with the home builders. To get started, I'm going to kick it over to Kevin Young with the Department of Land Conservation and Development, who has been one of the leads on the rulemaking effort, and he'll also be joined in part, and at least for the Q&A, by some other members of the DLCD team, including Ethan Stuckmeyer, who's on the housing policy team, and Evan Manville, who has been leading on the parking related components of the climate friendly and equitable communities rules. So Kevin, I'll kick it over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Jeremy. And good morning, everyone. My name is Kevin Young. I'm a senior urban planner with the Department of Land Conservation and Development. I'm one of the project managers for the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities rulemaking effort that's been underway for about a year and a half now. So we will be providing sort of an overview of the rules at this point. I will say, if you haven't heard of this, it's not for lack of effort. We were looking at our public engagement on this project so far, and I believe even if we exclude the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, which Jeremy and Samantha and Matt all served on, thank you very much. If we exclude those meetings and the LCDC meetings, we still have had over 100 public outreach meetings on the rulemaking. It is fairly technical, so we will step through this not in excruciating detail. I'm joined today by Evan Manville, our climate mitigation planner. Evan has led the development of the parking reform pieces of the rules, as well as has done the lead work on the electric vehicle charging aspects. Also joined by Ethan Stuckmeyer, our senior planner of housing programs. And Ethan is here today because he has been heavily engaged. He has led the implementation of House Bills 2001 and 2003. You probably remember House Bill 2001, commonly referred to as the Middle Housing Bill. He is also part of a team that's working on the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Program. And so he is here if we have more housing specific questions and can speak to how the climate friendly and equitable communities piece would interact with those regulations as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share screens, and I will turn things over to Evan to kind of provide some background on the rules.
Thank you, Kevin. Folks, as Kevin noted, I'm a climate mitigation planner here at DLCD. My pronouns are he, him. And as Jeremy ably noted, introduced, this is a big lift. This is a big rulemaking that we're involved in. So we're thrilled to be with you today to go through it. Next slide. Oregon is dramatically missing its goals when it comes to climate pollution reduction, particularly in the transportation sector. Transportation is the largest portion of Oregon's climate pollution. It's about 40% of it, 38 to 40%. And we're way off track. We have a vision and a legislatively adopted goal to reduce climate pollution by 2050 by a significant amount. And on our current path, we're going to miss that dramatically. And that has real world impacts for Oregonians. People are losing their homes in wildfires. People are dying in heat waves. Certain economic sectors like the shellfish industry are being impacted dramatically, as well as the timber industry. So we need to course correct. And this is part of that effort to course correct and try to get us to Oregon's adopted goals. Next slide. The second thread that's core to this rulemaking is equity. Oregon, from its founding, has written inequity and discrimination into its laws and constitution. And we've got a lot of work to undo that. Some of that has come through in the land use and transportation decisions we've made in the past, where we cited highways, how we spent our money, the shameful legacy of redlining, and kind of the exclusionary zoning that took redlining's place when redlining was outlawed. And what the impact of that has been is really to concentrate wealth in white households. The average white household has about 10 times as much wealth as the average Black household. And part of that is because the intergenerational wealth is mainly in real estate, as you all know. And so those people who were excluded from those options decades ago are feeling it still today. Their descendants are feeling it today. So we got a lot of work to do on equity. And part of the governor's order was to center marginalized populations and underserved populations. Next slide. The last thread that we like to remind folks of, what this rulemaking is thinking of is, hey, the demographics of who live in households has changed dramatically over the last couple generations. And you all are aware of this as professionals in this, that the nuclear family household is dramatically shrunk to about 1 out of every 5 households. And the single person household has increased to nearly 1/3 of all households. And those trends look to continue roughly. So the types of housing that the market is going to be demanding and needing has shifted over time, and we think will continue to shift. So this chart on the left is from AARP. So I want to give them credit for that. Next slide. Jeremy mentioned our boss's order, Governor Brown, directing state agencies to course correct on climate. She directed lots of different agencies to do lots of different things, particularly us and ODOT to take on transportation pollution through land use and transportation plans. Next slide. What we're hoping to get is more of some great places in Oregon. This is McMinnville's downtown. We are hoping to create more places where Oregonians can meet their basic needs without having to drive everywhere or to take shorter car trips, because that transportation pollution is pretty much about driving and driving too much. So we're hoping to have more of those places. Most Oregonians under our goals will still not live in the downtowns of the world, but the hope is to have about 1/3 of Oregonians live in places where they can meet their basic needs without driving everywhere. So hoping to get more of those great places in the future. Next slide. The rulemaking is focused just on the population centers in Oregon where most transportation pollution happens. The smaller communities and more rural communities aren't impacted. So it's just really these 8 MPOs, which is the lines that we draw on maps, the places where there are more than 50,000 people together in Oregon. So those are the areas these rules would apply in, both the cities and the county areas inside the urban growth boundaries in those areas. Next slide. The process has been very, very intensive. As Kevin noted, several people here have served on this rulemaking advisory committee. This is the largest rulemaking advisory committee we've had, to our knowledge, in DLCD's history. We did a lot of work to bring together an advisory committee that both had people from all 8 of those areas and had people from underserved communities, those voices that are traditionally excluded. So we really tried to build an advisory committee that looked like Oregon or could speak for those people who aren't in the room, such as people experiencing homelessness, people with disabilities, have some more income diversity, not just the wealthy, privileged folks who are traditionally able to serve on those advisory committees. So they've had 11 meetings thus far and may have a 12th, we'll see. But really engage them and build on their knowledge and insights. Next slide. So this is kind of the process, how it's gone over the last couple of years. There are things to the left of this where we've been thinking about this for many years before 2020, before the governor's order came down. But this was our last thing, our last take. Really tried to get big picture, where are we trying to head? And then we came up with some draft rules. And for the last several months, we've been kind of getting feedback on those draft rules and adjusting them and improving them, we think, with everyone's insights and adoption, or insights and thoughts. The adoption is aimed for May, and we'll get to that in a moment. And all along this, there's been a lot of public engagement, as you can see on the bottom of the slide. And I do want to emphasize the public engagement doesn't end once the commission adopts the rules. There's a lot of local implementation decisions that will include decisions on how communities want to implement these locally, and we're going to fund some community engagement for that. So because we do realize each community is unique, and you're adopting them. Next slide. Do you want to take it from here?
You bet. Happy to do that, Evan. Thank you for that great overview. So now we're going to kind of dive down into the rules. So the draft rules have been published by the Secretary of State's office. They were published on March 1st, and we are gearing up for our first hearing with the Land Conservation and Development Commission at the end of this month. That'll be the initial hearing. Their next hearing will be in May, and at that hearing, we're hoping that the rules will be adopted. We'll provide the schedule and opportunity information on how to provide input on this later on in this presentation, but just to kind of frame where we are in the process. So the rules will impact these different areas of basically land use and transportation planning. The first category is regional planning to meet pollution reduction targets. I'll speak to that briefly. And then there is the second package of updated land use and transportation rules, including climate-friendly areas, reforming parking management, supporting electric vehicle charging, providing high-quality pedestrian, bicycle, and transit infrastructure, moving transportation planning beyond a sole focus on motor vehicle congestion standards, which has been past practice, and lastly, prioritizing and selecting projects that meet climate and equity outcomes. All right, so I will tackle the first set of rules here, if I can make this slide advance. There we go. And this is speaking to the regional scenario planning process. So first of all, it's important to note that the Portland metro region is unique in the state in that it is the one region that has already developed a preferred scenario through the scenario planning process. So this is a plan that was developed by Metro in cooperation, partnership with all of the local governments within the region, known as the Climate Smart Strategy. So this was adopted 2014, approved by the Land Conservation and Development Commission in 2015. And so that region is well on its way to addressing climate pollution reduction based on this plan that was developed. And so as our rules touch on the metro region, you'll see that there are some differences basically to acknowledge the progress that's already been made in the Portland metro region. Scenario planning is one of those areas. In the other 7 regions, they have yet to do regional scenario planning. And so our draft rules have identified the next 2 largest population centers Eugene, Springfield, and Salem Kaiser as the next candidates for regional scenario planning. I'm happy to say that ODOT has identified funding to support that work, and the rules will require those regions to engage in regional scenario planning, which essentially is the local governments within the region coming together, looking at their framework for planning, coming up with evaluation criteria, basically looking at alternative scenarios, which would be packages of policies, actions, investments designed to reduce climate pollution consistent with the regional pollution reduction targets, and then to select a preferred scenario and then implement and monitor that scenario. So Eugene, Springfield, and Salem Kaiser will be doing that work in the near term. For the other regions, so there would be 5 remaining regions, they will essentially be doing this process until and unless we're able to secure additional funding to support scenario planning. We will begin with a regional assessment of current plans within each of these regions, identifying gaps between those plans and climate and equity goals, improving the local plans, and then implementing those plans on a 4 to 5 year planning cycle. So that is essentially the regional planning piece of the rules. Next, I'm going to speak about climate-friendly areas. And again, as I said before, the Portland metro region is a little bit different because, again, they have made significant progress on enacting their or implementing their preferred scenario. One of the ways they've done so is to develop the 2040 growth concept. And that concept identifies town and regional centers, which will function much like climate-friendly areas. Although most of those town and regional centers have been adopted and zoned, there are a few that have yet to do so. And so as our rules touch on the Portland metropolitan region, they will require First Metro, the regional governing body, to establish a requirement for local government adoption of those centers and land use regulations no later than December 31st of 2024. Following that action, those local governments that have yet to adopt those regional town and regional centers will be required to comply with that by December 31st of 2025, so 1 year later. Another ongoing obligation within the region and actually throughout the 8 regions is that cities with a population over 10,000 will be reporting on affordable housing production, mitigation of displacement, and increasing housing choices within those Region 2040 centers every 6 years. That's done in conjunction with the new requirement for housing production strategy work that came about with passage of House Bill 2003. Elsewhere, in the other 7 regions in the state, we're basically starting from scratch on the climate-friendly areas. And so what are they? Climate-friendly areas are walkable, mixed-use areas that allow for a variety of uses: residential, office, retail, services, public uses. The idea is, as Evan said, to create an environment where people are less dependent on vehicle trips in order to meet their daily needs. The rules don't presume that everybody needs to live in a climate-friendly area. In fact, all of this work is based on some modeling work that was done. It's referred to as the Statewide Transportation Strategy, developed by ODOT and adopted around 2013. And that model essentially says that we are able to meet our climate pollution reduction goals with this package of actions. Climate-friendly areas is one of those actions. And so the requirement here is for local governments with population over 10,000 to zone areas, these mixed-use areas, to accommodate at least 30% of housing needs. So that means not necessarily requiring housing to be located in those areas, but to enable at least 30% of housing to be accommodated in these areas. In conjunction with those zone changes and regulatory changes, there will be associated requirements for high quality pedestrian, bicycle, and transit services within those areas to make it easier for people to use other transportation options. There are parking reform measures that will help to reduce the amount of land area within these areas that's dedicated to surface parking. The rules also allow for abutting high-density residential or employment areas to be included. And then local governments, there's two paths that local governments can use in terms of adopting regulations on climate-friendly areas. They may choose either prescriptive or outcome-based standards, which I'll go into in a minute, but I see Jeremy's come on screen and maybe he has a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a clarifying question because I know this was something that came up a lot in the Rural Advisory Committee. The 30%, can you just clarify for the audience about whether that means 30% of future needed housing, the growth in housing, or 30% total? So that's one question. And then there's been a couple questions coming in the chat sort of asking about the timelines for the non-metro areas. And I assume you're going to get into that, so don't worry about that now. Just wanted to mention that that was coming up in the chat. Thank you.
Yes, I will talk about timelines in just a moment. Thanks, Jeremy. And yes, 30% is, our goal is for 30% of all housing to be accommodated in these areas. Again, the statewide transportation strategy sets a target for us of meeting that by the year 2035. Obviously, we can't mandate development in these areas. So what we're talking about is essentially what I call setting the table for that development to occur. I'll talk a little bit more about how that interacts with other housing needs a little bit later, but thanks for the questions. All right. So I was talking a little bit about prescriptive versus outcome-oriented standards. This table illustrates the requirements in the current draft of the rules. So these requirements apply to all cities and urbanized county areas within those 7 metropolitan regions with population over 5,000 within an urban growth boundary, essentially. For those smallest communities, they are, growing cities, many of them. They begin by simply designating at least 25 acres as a climate-friendly area. If they choose a prescriptive standard path, that would entail a requirement for minimum densities of 15 dwelling units per net acre within those areas, and allowing for maximum building heights no less than 50 feet in those areas. If they instead choose to follow the outcome-oriented standards, essentially this is a way for local governments to say, hey, we have an existing set of regulations that achieve these goals, or we are developing a set of regulations that will achieve these goals. This is essentially saying, okay, what you need to do, local government, is to demonstrate that these rules would enable development of 20 homes and jobs per net acre. And I say homes and jobs because both are really critical. We're talking about housing here because it's a more easily measurable quantity than employment is in these areas. And so that's why there's so much of an emphasis on housing. But I also need to stress that employment opportunities and services and all of those other good things should be located within climate-friendly areas as well. So as you can see, there's a prescriptive path, and then there's an outcome-oriented path. And as the size of the local governments increases, then the requirements become greater. So that for cities with population over 50,000 or 50,000 and above, prescriptive standards would require 25 dwelling units per net acre and allowed building heights no less than 85 feet, or on the outcome-oriented path, demonstration that the standards could produce 40 homes and jobs per net acre. One additional nuance here is that cities will be able to designate one climate-friendly area, or they may designate multiple climate-friendly areas. And if they designate more than one climate-friendly area, there's an allowance for the establishment of a primary climate-friendly area that meets the highest standards. And the local government can then choose to implement lesser standards in other climate-friendly areas, what might be often referred to as nodal centers. So a larger city might say, in our downtown or wherever our primary CFA is, we're going to go with 25 dwelling units per acre, 85 feet building heights, but in some of these satellite climate-friendly areas, we might have 15 dwelling units per acre and building heights no less than 50 feet. In terms of the implementation schedule, these are the requirements. So following rule adoption, which again, we're hoping is May of this year, local governments would have until June 30 of 2023 to study potential climate-friendly areas and provide also an analysis of equitable housing outcomes, which I'll explain in just a minute. So essentially the work in year one is looking at potential climate-friendly areas based on locational criteria, existing zoning, et cetera. And then figuring out, basically which ones look like they're going to be the best candidates. The great news here is that we do have funding available to support this work. Evan and others at the department have done a whole lot of legwork in the regions, talking to local governments about how to get this work started quickly. We fully intend to support local government work in terms of doing the studies. The analysis of equitable housing outcomes needs to occur at this stage because we want to build in consideration of potential negative impacts that could result from the zoning of climate-friendly areas, namely displacement or gentrification impacts that might displace underserved populations. And so the analysis would include, and actually we're working on a mapping data layer that would apply statewide that local governments can use to assist in this analysis, to look at areas that might be vulnerable to displacement or gentrification. And so looking at that in conjunction with the study of climate-friendly areas, and that may inform some decisions about where climate-friendly areas are located, or the local government may identify mitigation actions that they might employ to mitigate displacement that would otherwise occur as part of that work. So that's year one. Year two, the local governments are developing the zoning and comp plan amendments for those climate-friendly areas. And the deadline there is June 30 of 2024. Associated with this zoning is a transportation review process. And this takes the place of another process that typically occurs with zone changes that looks at significant effects to vehicle trips. Instead, this transportation review analyzes gaps for various transportation modes and requires planning to fill those gaps. In some cases, highway impacts analysis is required where climate-friendly areas would be proximate to highway facilities. As the rule touches on housing, again, as I outlined for the metro area and elsewhere in the other 7 regions, the cities over 10,000 would monitor and report on housing production in climate-friendly areas as part of that housing production strategy work. One additional provision is a requirement that beginning June 30 of 2027, urban growth boundary expansions based on residential needs will trigger an additional climate-friendly area designation. And that requirement is for enough area to accommodate the equivalent of half of the additional residential need. It's a complex requirement, and there has been some concern that this is actually taking away potential lands that might serve other residential needs. So I'm going to step through this process in a little more detail. Firstly, a few basic questions that we've heard. Do the new rules require 30% of housing to be located in climate-friendly areas? No, they don't. They require local governments to plan and zone these areas to support that level of housing. We know local governments can't require housing to be constructed. We can't require housing to be constructed. We're setting the table for that development. Will the designation of climate-friendly areas reduce the supply of land available for other types of needed housing? No, it will not. Climate-friendly area requirements will actually expand opportunities for residential development. And I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail here with this example. So this is a hypothetical scenario of a local government that has found the need for expansion of its urban growth boundary. And typically that's done through a housing needs analysis. In this case, the housing needs analysis finds a residential land need to accommodate an additional 200 units of low density housing. The low density zone allows detached single family and middle housing types with an average density of 8 units per acre. That low density precludes climate-friendly areas from accommodating that residential need. If you recall, the minimum densities there are 15 units per acre. So based on this calculation, the additional land need to meet that low density residential land need is 200. So you've got 200 units divided by 8 units per acre means a 25 acre UGB expansion, urban growth boundary expansion. So that occurs. Concurrently, the city then designates additional climate-friendly areas sufficient to accommodate half of that need based on average buildable residential area calculations. So this is additional above and beyond housing supply to accommodate housing within climate-friendly areas. Those average buildable residential area calculations anticipate 25 units per acre. If half of the identified need is 100 dwelling units at 25 units per acre, then 4 areas of additional CFA area or climate-friendly area would be required in conjunction with that UGB expansion. This map kind of shows you the different areas. So here is the initial climate-friendly area. Here's the additional climate-friendly area. That UGB expansion area may be completely separate. So this would be the low density need. This is the initial CFA, and then the required expansion of climate-friendly area elsewhere in the urban growth boundary. All right, I think I turn next to Evan to talk about parking.
Thank you, Kevin. And super quickly to a couple of questions. I have emailed a PDF of this presentation to Jeremy. We work for you all. We're the state government, so it's a public record, and it's there for you. So certainly understand the desire to review this afterwards. And secondly, this is all being done under the state's land use planning program under Oregon Revised Statute 197. So that's kind of where the authority comes for this work. Lots of great questions, but let's keep rolling. Downtown parking. Why is parking reform part of this rulemaking? Well, first, parking is a big user of land. And when we're trying to create walkable communities that pushes uses apart from each other, makes it harder to walk. And it also really precludes other things from happening there. So this is an aerial view of the off-street parking in downtown Corvallis. Corvallis is not unique in downtowns. This is similar to a lot of downtowns all around Oregon. Next slide. Secondly, a lot of parking is overbuilt. When we go in and we say, hey, cities have required builders of multifamily development to require X number of parking spaces, how much of it is used, we find by and large that it's overbuilt, that on average 20 to 40% of parking stalls aren't used at peak use, like overnight in families in housing, for example. That's consistent with studies from California and Washington and other places. It's not universally overbuilt, but there's some waste there, and that means cost to people trying to provide housing, which is a critical need in Oregon. Next slide. Thirdly, requiring a bunch of parking with each new development can be a real trade-off. Here's a study from Eugene that said, hey, there's this lot, we can build a 4-plex on it, providing 4 families with housing if we provide just 3 off-street parking spaces. But the requirement in the code is that we require a parking space for each unit, and therefore the only thing that can pencil is a duplex. So we have fundamentally traded a car parking spot for 2 housing units, and that's, I don't think, in line with Oregon's priorities to deal with the housing crisis. But that's fundamentally what happens when we have excessive parking requirements. Next slide. And the last thing is parking is related to one of the core parts of this rulemaking, which is driving. Not surprisingly, when you provide a lot of something for free, people consume more of it than they would otherwise. So when you provide parking along with a unit, people are more likely to have more cars and they're likely to drive more. Similarly at businesses. So there's pretty good evidence that parking results in more driving. And census rulemaking is thinking about how to reduce how much driving happens. Allowing it but not requiring parking seems like a basic step. Next slide. So the draft rules do three main things. The first is they take some of the kind of best practices in parking codes from around local governments around Oregon, and they say, hey, all communities should be doing this and counting parking spaces in this way and allowing some exemptions in these circumstances. The second thing it does is it asks each community to choose one of three parking reform approaches. And the first is to deregulate parking, is to let the diversity of developments provide the diversity of parking desired. And communities around the world have done that for a couple of decades. It seems to work pretty well. You all understand what your potential clients need in terms of how much parking and what it should look like. Why should the government get in the way? But if communities don't want to do that, there are two other options. The first is saying, hey, in those areas well served by transit and in those downtowns, we're going to reduce parking mandates. And you're going to do, local communities are also going to adopt some local policies like something called unbundling, which says, hey, you rent your parking space separate from your unit. Just something large cities often do anyway, but their cities can require everyone to do that. And the third option is to just say, all right, you don't want to adopt those policies, but we're going to reduce parking mandates for a variety of things. Types of development, historic property redevelopment, for example, that sort of thing. And in larger areas, we're just going to let the market figure it out. So one of three options cities can choose there. And the last thing the draft parking rules do is it says those communities over 100,000 have to do more. They have to do things like set parking maximums. The largest communities have to start thinking about pricing on-street parking if they're going to keep doing parking mandates, that sort of thing. So that's the overview. Next slide. So these are kind of some examples of places where reducing parking mandates is in the draft rules. Multifamily, super small residences, affordable housing, treatment facilities and homes for people with disabilities. Domestic violence shelters are also on there, but not on this slide. And then kind of those places where transit, well served by transit, and those climate friendly areas. And that's kind of what the literature and all the studies show, is that the biggest predictor of parking consumption is how well an area is served by transit. And the next after that is density. So that's where the literature and the data demonstrate we can scale back how much we're forcing parking at each development to provide a bunch of parking. Next slide. So beyond parking reform, for a while we were trying to do a fair amount on electric vehicle charging as our commission's charge. Lawyers talk to lawyers, and we've scaled that back significantly. But what we're saying is, as we're doing new development in line with what the legislature passed, 20% of spaces for new residential and mixed use development have to have the conduit installed as part of development. So not the chargers themselves, not the wiring, not even the capacity, but you have to put in the tubes while you're building it. That's by far the cheapest time to do it. Our draft rules say beyond those 20% required by the legislature, we want an additional set of spaces, because Oregon is really trying to boost the EV future, and putting stuff in buildings that are going to be around for 80 or 100 years makes a lot of sense as you're constructing them now. So level 1, level 2, direct for those are EV things. Level 1 is just a basic wall plug. So, you know, it's pretty cheap to do that. So that's where that is. Next slide. So beyond the land use, parking, and EV stuff, we are proposing updating Oregon's transportation planning rules. And these are rules that DLCD and ODOT have worked on for a long time, but they haven't gotten us where we need. So we're asking to go a little further and to think more and do some more planning and do some more analysis, making sure that we provide communities where people have real options in how they get around. Next slide. So we are asking and working to fund additional looks at the existing pedestrian and bicycle and transit networks, and how incomplete they are and where the needs are to have complete networks so people have real choices, especially those large number of Oregonians who cannot drive themselves, but for all Oregonians who deserve choices. And the goal is really to figure out where the gaps are and to increase the quality of those networks. Really make sure we have connected, safe, and complete networks so people can choose how they get around. There's a particular emphasis in the draft rules on making sure climate-friendly areas are walkable, since that's really what we're hoping for. And when we say walkable, we mean walkable or usable with a mobility device. There's a diversity of transportation options that aren't, that are included in those broad terms, as well as those areas with underserved populations and those key destinations. So thinking about, for example, safe routes to school, that sort of thing, really trying to make sure that people can get where they need to go if they choose without driving. Next slide. We are also asking as communities develop their transportation system plans, and that's a basic plan that all communities in Oregon have been required to do for a long time, is to build a list of projects that works towards meeting our climate goals and thinks about a variety of factors. We're not requiring that each plan meet the climate goals because funding might not be available and other things, but we're requiring to build that list. And then we also are asking folks to do analysis beyond just basic vehicle congestion as a single measure. That's in the past been a single lens to look at things through, and we're asking communities to do a more analysis and to really do some thinking about when they're spending a lot of money on road expansions, if there are cheaper alternatives that can also meet those goals. Next slide. So that's the draft set of rules by and large. There's a lot there. I see the huge number of questions coming in, love it. As noted, here's where we are. We're before the first public hearing. The commission has been hearing about this issue for the last 5 years at each of its meetings, but this is the first official hearing where you have and people have been testifying about it for 5 years, but this is the first official rules hearing. The plan is to go to adoption at the next meeting in May. Hopefully we'll probably do some amendments in between those two meetings based on public input, because we continue to adjust the rules. And then starting in June, there would be the rules effective date, and each community would start taking some actions in line with the rules, such as setting performance measures and parking reform and doing some of the climate friendly area work. The transportation system plan items would be based on when communities choose to update their TSPs, which varies from community to community. There's no, and as funding is available, since those are usually state funded. So that's where we're at. Next slide. So here's formally how you all can provide input. There's an email address up there. You can submit it to Casario Taylor, who's our Rockstar commission rulemaking person, or you can testify in person. Due to the time limits, it may just be a couple of minutes, but there is an opportunity to testify orally should you want to do that. All these meetings are remote, so and virtual for now. Next slide. Yeah, so we have a bunch more materials on our website. Simple one-pagers, complex 100-page rack packets that Jeremy's familiar with. The rules themselves, which are, yeah, which you can look at all the details there, as well as all the history, some various recordings of various webinars and things that we've done. Can we go back up one slide, Kevin? I'm sorry. A lot of people, I talk too fast and we flip through the slide too fast, but people want that contact info. So back up one. Yeah, fabulous. So there you go. Yeah, we'll leave that on the screen for a minute.
I'm sorry.
Oh, and
Just want everyone to know that we'll also send out an email with more information, links to the rules and more information about how you can weigh in. So that'll be coming as well.
Wonderful. That's the end of our presentation. We're happy to look at the questions ourselves. We're happy to have you read the questions to us, Jeremy, in the order you would like them answered.
Yeah, I'll probably just pick a few, and just want everyone to know, well, first of all, I want to thank all of the presenters here from DLCD for the time and effort that they've put into breaking all this down, being able to take the time to come here and present it to our association and be willing to take questions about it. So everyone give them a round of applause for that. And we're going to save the chat and pull all the questions, because there's no way we're going to get to even a small percentage of these questions today, and we've got to move on to our next speakers as well. So we'll do a few of them, and then we'll save that, and then we can work to try to answer some of those, or work with the department to try to answer some of those. And I'm sure that there'll be more FAQs coming both from the department and from us as this continues to go forward. So those will get addressed one way or the other. But maybe I'll just hit on a few questions, just sort of based on what I saw coming into the chat. And maybe we'll start with the transportation stuff and then move our way back to the housing stuff. So one of the questions I saw come up a few times was sort of about the impact on business of the parking requirements. So we talk a lot about housing units and, what's mandated related to housing units, but of course, people park to visit and shop at businesses, and that's a part of the economic development of some communities, and particularly those that draw in people from other areas or from suburban satellite areas. So how do you see that playing out in terms of impact on economic development and businesses from the parking requirements?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. So first, there's very little in the parking requirements that limits how much parking people can build. So businesses that think their customers need a lot of parking can provide a lot of parking. And what we're saying is that government shouldn't require those businesses who don't think they need parking to provide parking. Generally, commercial areas and commercial downtowns, more than half of a piece of property is used for parking. That's a business decision, but it is a business cost. And so the government shouldn't be forcing that cost on folks that don't want it. So so generally we're not getting in the way. Cities have to set some parking maximums, but those aren't super strong and they're not much beyond what current requirements are. So if people need parking, build parking.
Okay, thanks for that. So another question on the transportation piece. So of course, many individuals and many lower income individuals, are not going to be living in the climate friendly area. They might be living in other surrounding areas, but still need to get around and need to park when they go to their work and other things like this. And of course, we don't yet know what the type of housing units will look like in these areas. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the housing, but it could be, that's what that equity analysis will show, but we don't yet know if that's going to be accommodative to lower income individuals. So for those folks who need to get around and need to get to their places and aren't living in these areas, you mentioned that the prioritization efforts will try to prioritize transit and non-driving investments, but sort of where does the funding come for that? And sort of what's the broader strategy if we're going to reduce parking and reduce investments in driving related facilities? How do we get to that place where folks can still get around and get where they need to go if they're not living right and working right in one of these walkable communities?
Yeah. So there's some things that are within the commission's authority and some things that aren't. Transit funding, for example, is not in our authority. So this is the planning for the networks. This is saying, hey, to have a complete network, what would that look like? And then build your list of projects and see how much you can fund. So there is not, we can't solve the transportation funding problem ourselves. I would say that currently a lot of people can't get around because they don't drive. And so because we failed to provide complete networks for people with disabilities, for kids, for the elderly, for the poor, for those who aren't allowed to own cars, that's the current situation for them. And so those people who choose to drive will continue to have the pretty complete road network that they do. And we're not reducing the existing parking supply. What we're saying is those people in the future who want to build less parking will be allowed to build less parking. And so, yeah, in some places it may mean that places people have to pay to park a car and pay to have that 200 square feet of space that they need to store their vehicle. And that's, we think, probably a fair thing to do when people are consuming that's a cost that the public has generally borne that now the individual may bear. But I think that's pretty far down the road in most communities. I think most parking will continue to be free and plentiful. This is just a nudge, a first baby step along that line. So yeah, a lot of this is not part of the rulemaking as far as what gets built, and it's more what do we plan for and how do we think through those project lists.
Great, thanks, Evan. If it's okay to go back to the housing and do a couple questions there, and then we'll switch over to our next guest speakers. So one of a few questions I saw in there were about this, the sort of performance-based approach, the alternative approach about the jobs and housing units, and sort of what does that mean? How is that calculated? How is that demonstrated by a local government to show you that they're hitting 40 jobs and housing units? And is it like, is it 39 jobs in one housing? I mean, what does it make a difference, a type of job, and just how would that even be demonstrated to you from a local government?
Sure, that's a good question. And this is new stuff, so I think we will be kind of learning over time. But essentially, the obligation is to demonstrate that that a local government's package of zoning regulations would accommodate that level of development. And I think you could look at some of the same assumptions about like the typical size of a multifamily unit, looking at, say, office spaces and a typical number of jobs that you might have in an office facility. And so if you're, say, your building heights and your you might have, for example, an FAR requirement. So a lot of cities will have a minimum FAR, which is a floor area ratio that gets at, hey, you need to build buildings to a certain level of intensity That's something that isn't in current place in the prescriptive set of rules, but a local government might have a package of regulations that's really designed to do that. Of course, the easiest thing for them to do is to say, hey, we've had these rules on the books for a while, and here's some examples of development that has accomplished that within those zones. That's a pretty straightforward exercise. But aside from that, yeah, there's going to need to be some sort of demonstration of, yeah, this package of zoning regulations will allow for this level of development. It doesn't say we're going to mandate that level of development every time, but it would allow for that level of development.
Great, thanks, Kevin. So maybe let's do one more because we do need to switch over. And again, we know there are so many questions. We'll do our best to follow up on those, and this will be an ongoing conversation. But so one of the things that I've raised on the rulemaking committee is sort of the desire for more analysis about the sort of types of housing units that would be developed in the CFAs based on market realities in the different communities, and sort of what's likely to actually be produced there. And so the question I have, so it sounds like rather than doing that now, the approach is to kind of push some of that analysis to the city level when they're proposing climate friendly areas, and they do their equity analysis and kind of determine what types of units would be built here and their price point, would that cause displacement and other issues. So the question I have for you guys on that is, what happens if that local government's analysis shows that either, hey, our market isn't really building at 25 units per acre and we're not sure we're going to get a lot of that here, or they say the types of building units that will be here are likely going to be more luxury apartments, and so there is an equity displacement concern, based on that. Sort of, what do they do next, since the rules framework is already there?
Right. So part of that work is going to be done in the study phase for climate friendly areas, and that's why we want local governments to do the legwork early. That could include market analysis. It's not required to include market analysis. But a point about that is that, the markets are evolving, and I'll be quite honest, we have cities that are built quite to a large degree to accommodate, our reliance on vehicles to meet our transportation needs. And we are seeing right now with increased gas prices, how vulnerable we are to those impacts. And those impacts are felt, most strongly at the lowest end of the economic ladder. And so part of this is building in more resilience for people in terms of where they live and the costs that are entailed in how they live. But that doesn't answer your question. So let me get back to that question, which is how do we work the market considerations in? It is to a degree up to the local government. One of the adjustments that we did make in the rules, as I noted earlier, is that, I think our first draft said, hey, in a larger city, you need to build up to, this high, and, the most intensive kind of climate friendly area. We heard loud and clear from Matt and others that, hey, that may not work. For example, in Medford, the market doesn't seem to be supporting that. And so there is some allowance to plan for lower intensity climate friendly areas. There is a requirement for a primary climate friendly area to be zoned to allow more things. But frankly, that is all that's required, is to allow for that level of development. If it doesn't happen over time, we may look at the rules and figure out, okay, this isn't successful. There may be some adjustments that we need to make. But on its face, what we're saying is that you need to allow for certain levels of development. We are also asking local governments to kind of look at their housing production, look at tools they can use to incentivize that housing production. Part of our work has been engaging with Oregon Housing and Community Services on funding decisions that they make to support affordable housing development. And we've made really significant progress there in terms of their willingness to support some affordable housing developments in these areas. I want to be clear, we're not talking about all affordable housing funding would go to these areas, but they will be high opportunity areas. They'll have good jobs, good housing, all those opportunities that we want everybody to enjoy. And we recognize that the market alone isn't going to produce housing that's affordable to everyone. So that is an important component.
And I'm sorry, guys, my internet connection is getting a little unstable. So Kevin, did you finish your response?
I did. I don't know, Ethan, you've been very patient. If you want to add anything, I'll give you the opportunity.
And I will just say we're at noon, and so we do need to switch over to our next guest to make sure we give them enough time as well. I mean, Ethan, if you want to say something real quick, that's fine. But I do want to wrap up if we can.
Yeah, I think just the general, I can be really, really quick. I think just the general thought process behind this rulemaking and others that the agency is doing is that we are in a system, in a current environment where we need more housing supply desperately. And so allowing these kind of greater efficient, uses of our land within our UGBs is really the primary core of this kind of work. And so, that's increasing the housing supply, therefore increases housing choice and housing options, and therefore increases the overall affordability of those housing and releases that kind of pressure valve, or releases the pressure on the spectrum of housing. And that's really kind of the point of this. And so, that's just kind of my final thought there on that. But thank you.
Great. Yeah, and I'm really apologize. My internet connection is getting unstable, but thank you, Evan, Kevin, and Ethan, so much for your time, for putting this presentation together, for breaking it down. What's taken months, or a year to, breaking it down and to be able to do it in an hour. We can't thank you enough for that. We'll follow up with all of you on some of the additional questions in the chat. Maybe we can work together on answering those. And everybody, please offer your thanks in the chat and give a round of applause to our speakers from DLCD. And if we can promote our next speakers and let the DLCD team head back into the audience, that would be great. Thanks again. All right. Well, thank you again to DLCD for the presentation. Now we wanted the opportunity for you to hear from a couple of stakeholders who've been involved in the rulemaking process and get their take on the draft rules. So we have Matt Brinkley, who's the city planner for the city of Medford, a city who would be affected by these rules in the larger city category, and Samantha Bear, who is the housing policy director for the Oregon Home Builders Association. So Matt, maybe I'll start with you. Cities are obviously the ones going to be most affected by this. So hearing your perspective as a important and major Oregon city, we'd love to get your take on these rules and what they mean.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jeremy, and appreciate the opportunity to address your membership here. So thanks to the Oregon Realtors for having me today. This has been a very significant change, or will be a significant change, not just to the transportation rules, but rules that potentially affect land use as well, as you just heard from Kevin and Evan. And it's really, I guess, difficult to convey just how sweeping these changes are. We've had the same transportation planning rule for quite a while now. It hasn't changed very much during the past 10, 15 years. And this is a significant change that will impact, cities of many different sizes throughout the state of Oregon. And Medford, of course, is one that will be affected pretty significantly. And it will be affected significantly, not just because of what you heard about the designation of climate-friendly areas, which is a significant land use sort of issue that we will have to take up, but the transportation rules themselves and how we go about planning for our transportation facilities and then funding the construction of those facilities, which ultimately support development of needed housing, for example. So the rulemaking process itself has been highly compressed. It happened over a relatively short period of time. And just to kind of give your membership, your audience here, an idea, comparing this to what happened in California not too long ago, in a similar kind of shift, how we look at transportation planning and how we evaluate transportation facilities. It took the state of California about 7 years to make that shift. And here in the state of Oregon, we've done this in, less than 2 years. I mean, really, it's been in the past 6 months that we've really started to get into these rules as a rules making advisory committee. And so it's a highly compressed timeline in terms of coming up with the rules, and that has been challenging. As DLCD tries to take all of the comments, and there have been a lot of comments, as Jeremy knows, a lot of comments on the part of the RAC that have gone into this rule that you see now. I think a lot of us still have a lot of concerns about implementation of the rule. It will be a heavy lift for many communities at a time when we have less funding for staff, and that's a significant concern. And it's also an implementation concern or challenge from the standpoint that cities and counties don't typically build housing. The city of Medford doesn't do that. We partner with various non-for-profit and for-profit housing developers to support those efforts, but we don't build the housing. And ultimately, this rule will only be successful if housing like the housing that is described in the rule gets built in climate-friendly areas, and we have this shift in the way that we travel about through our communities and outside of them. And that's a very complicated issue. And we do have concerns about how we implement this, how it actually gets done, so that we're successful, so that we have communities that provide adequate housing for all of our citizens. And I think equity is a huge issue, and looking at gentrification displacement is a huge concern that we have with the rule, as well as achieving those greenhouse gas emissions reductions and achieving the goals that the rule has set out. So I do have to commend Kevin and Evan and the others at DLCD who have worked so hard to put this together in such a short period of time. It is going to be, I think, a difficult thing to do as we transition now from having a final rule to actually implementing it. You all saw the schedule that we're facing. That is not a lot of time to get comprehensive plan amendments and development code amendments done to comply with the rule. So it's going to be a very interesting 2 to 3 years, and then from there.
Great. Hey, well, thanks a lot, Matt, and we'll come back and do some Q&A after we hear from Samantha as well, and can dive into some of those issues more deeply. But Samantha, do you want to give us a perspective from the home builders?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Samantha Baer. I am the Housing Program Director for the Oregon Home Builders. I'm going to first apologize that it looks like I'm maybe looking off screen. I'm having weird technical issues today, so I'm having to join you from my iPad, and I can't figure out how to look at everybody in the right way. So I apologize for that weird visual. But I also want to thank Jeremy and Matt and the team from DLCD on coming and having a great conversation today. We've had so many conversations about this issue over years now but it's great to continue being able to talk about it and keep working through the rules as they move to get implemented. I will just say, I don't think there's been really any dispute from anyone on the RAC, and certainly not from us, that we need to make meaningful strides in terms of climate mitigation in a timely way. And that I don't think anyone disagrees that having nice, walkable communities where people have access to public transit are a good thing. They are a good thing. And frankly, that's something that our planning system we should have already been doing up until this point. I think where the home builders' concerns, and I think the realtors and others' concerns have been, are how these rules interplay with our current housing crisis. What we know to be true, the Oregon Regional Housing Needs Analysis came out with this amazing report. We know that we need to build over 580,000 housing units in the next 20 years to meet our current demand. And that number includes a backlog of over 100,000 homes. And most of this needs to occur, housing needs to occur in our affordable and entry market space. We know that families earning at or near median family incomes, or even up to 120% of MFI in some communities, are being left out of the dream of home ownership, and that our communities of color are being disproportionately impacted. We're in a really serious and grave situation. Of all of you as real estate professionals know that and are feeling that right now in your day-to-day. What we also know, and I think Evan mentioned this earlier, is that a lot of this has been caused by federal, state, and even local regulations, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that have contributed to our housing crisis and that have contributed to people not being able to have the opportunity of home ownership. And what we don't want to have happen here in this rulemaking is that we create another major set of rules and regulations that accidentally or intentionally or whatever have any sort of consequences that exacerbate our housing crisis and make it more difficult for us to make the housing that we need to have it be at affordable rates, and do anything that increases underproduction, or worse, creates more barriers to home ownership for some people. So that is the big concern. You know, we don't want to look back in 10 years and say our heart was in the good place, our intentions were in the right place. We moved very fast to try to meet this urgency related to climate, but we accidentally put another system of power in place that encouraged gentrification, that created more barriers to home ownership because we didn't slow down and look at things in a technical way, or we didn't ground truth the rules. So that's just been the overarching concern. And it's our concern with these rules, and it's our concern with everything in the public policy space right now. We're in the middle of the housing crisis, and that needs to remain our number one priority. So I'm going to just go through quickly one example that we have of kind of a technical concern. And it's just one example, but I think it kind of highlights the issues that we're dealing with. And that has to do with the notion of minimum density requirements. And I want to make clear there's density requirements for how big the CFAs need to be, how we draw the climate friendly areas. But there's also land use requirements within CFAs. There's a ton of land use requirements within CFAs that will dictate down to how neighborhoods are now designed, where neighborhoods would be near other key community benefits. And then there's also minimum density requirements as land use regulations that local governments will have to implement. And that means what form, that will dictate what types of housing could be allowed and versus what types of housing won't be able to be allowed. And what we've heard from local governments, developers, builders in the areas where these minimum density requirements will come to effect is that they're set so high, like minimum densities are set so high that they'll actually preclude certain forms of housing. They will generally preclude single family development, and they will probably preclude duplexes and other forms of important middle housing that we've been trying to move forward on with HB 2001. And so I think it's interesting to hear from the department that they feel like these rules are increasing housing choice and increasing housing supply when there are literally prescriptive land use requirements that preclude a lot of forms of housing choice and housing type from being able to be built within CFAs. Just a technical note that I want to hit there. The minimum density requirements from our read of the rules doesn't apply in metro areas. Metro is on a different set of regulation, a more flexible set of regulation than what some of the other mid-sized cities would be. So what I'm talking about is really going to impact Medford. It's going to impact Bend, Albany, Salem, Kaiser, and all of our mid-size, I call them like suburban cities versus the metro area, which are on a separate, different regulatory structure. The other thing we've really heard is that where CFAs are, and which we already know to be true, is that the land prices are going to be very, very high. And it doesn't matter from when we're talking about bringing an affordable product to market, it's like baking a cake. If your base ingredient, your land price is so high, it really does prevent you from being able to bring an affordable product to market. So what we're really concerned about is that in these areas where CFAs are going to be designated, you're really only going to see, because of the minimum density requirements and the land prices, high density, vertical, expensive kind of rental based product. And you're going to see less opportunity for home ownership of affordable rates in the CFAs. And while exclusive high density zones may be good for reducing VMT, we worry that this is actually kind of a recipe for gentrification, and it will force individuals who want to own homes or who want to live in a low density or middle housing product to move outside of CFAs, which actually puts them away from any of the transportation benefits of the rules. And as I think Matt talked about, we're very concerned about how this is going to prevent local governments from being able to comply with HB 2001, which sought to allow duplexes on every lot or parcel where single family residential product is available. I'll just quickly wrap up because I know I'm kind of fire hosing and I'm talking a lot, and I apologize for that. Kind of what we've heard, and I think you've heard earlier, is that, these issues are going to be handled down the road through an anti-displacement toolkit, or it's going to be handled through the HB 2003 production strategies. Local governments will be able to mitigate any of the implications from the rules. But what we're concerned about is I don't know how a local government is able to mitigate implications from these rules when they have to follow the administrative rules. And I think there's been kind of a disconnect there of you're going to be able to solve it, you're going to be able to figure it out, but the rules are so prescriptive and they are administrative requirements that local governments must follow. It kind of feels like they've have their hands tied, and they're not going to be able to really mitigate the implications of the rules or mitigate gentrification, but maybe rather band-aid it, or do other things down the road to kind of lessen the impact, not solve any of the impact. And so that's one example, and one of the things we've been really concerned about, and why we've been asking for just a slowdown. We really want we want to slow down. We want to figure out the practical implications of these rules. We have done numerous calls for data asking to kind of ground truth a lot of this, and it hasn't happened yet. And I think there's still a lot of time that could happen, and I'm hopeful that it does before the rules come into effect. I will just say, for us, I think the biggest concern is, prior to this, housing felt like the number one priority. We made so much strides with HB 2001, so much strides with HB 2003, and solving our housing crisis was going to be the biggest priority of the state. And it feels like that this is sort of a retreat from that. And it seems like this is climate and solving climate and addressing climate urgency kind of supersedes needing to go and make sure that we're not having any negative implications from housing. And that's really concerning from us as housing advocates and us in the housing space, because we do want it to continue to be our number one priority. And frankly, we cannot afford any unintended consequences from these rules that set us behind in meeting our housing demand.
Well, thank you both so much for offering your perspectives, and maybe let's pick up where you left off right there, Samantha. You talked a bit about 2001 in middle housing, how this might impact that. Matt, I do want to get your perspective on sort of what 25 units an acre looks like, because I think just having people understand what that even means would be helpful, but I'll come back to that. But I want to start with you mentioned 2003, and this was the bill that really was attempting to revamp our approach to making sure that our housing needs analyses are accurate in terms of what we need. And then we as a community, develop strategies to actually meet those needs. And that was, a big step and a big change that came along with House Bill 2001, sort of revamping that process. And then the CFAC thing kind of came in on the side of that. And so I'm just curious your two's perspective on how this does or doesn't sync up with the approach that House Bill 2003 was carrying forward about how we were going to go about determining what our needs are and how to reach them through that process.
I guess I'll go first, give Samantha a break for a second. So as a planning director for a city of, nearly 90,000 people now, we have a lot going on, and House Bill 2001 and 2003 changed the way that we do things a little bit. We just completed a housing capacity analysis and our housing production strategies right before we got the rules for climate-friendly, equitable communities. And so now we will actually kind of stall adopting that new housing capacity analysis and our housing production strategies, because they will need to be sort of informed and probably changed, updated, based on what we do with climate-friendly areas as we try to implement climate-friendly, equitable communities rules. And I think that will be a little bit of a challenge, although the rule tries to separate your housing capacity analysis from climate-friendly areas and the housing that goes into them. And I think Kevin kind of provided a little bit of an example when he was talking about UGB amendments, which was helpful. That separation is a little bit artificial, because your housing capacity analysis is going to say you need so much housing of these different types based on your demographic makeup. And that's there, that's in your comp plan. How you implement climate-friendly areas and do all of your other zoning in your community is going to be based on that comp plan. And so there's a potential that somebody, could take a look at your comp plan and say, you don't need that much more high density land, for example. This potentially becomes a legal issue for cities and a basis for appeal for land use decisions, and something that I'm definitely concerned about. And just in a real practical sense, doing all of this stuff poses great challenges for departments that are running, that we're not getting more staff. Although we do appreciate DLCD making available to us a lot of technical assistance to do the initial work, in designating climate-friendly areas. Hopefully some support in doing the comp plan amendments, the land use regulation, changes, all that stuff. That's very helpful, but this is going to continue on after this initial implementation phase is over. And, we'll have to do reporting every year. TSPs are going to become way more difficult to do and more expensive, quite frankly. And those are all things that we're going to have to figure out. And so looking to the state for ongoing support is a really important part of this. If, again, we're going to be able to be successful, because if we can't do the work, it's just not going to happen. So.
Great, thanks, Matt. Appreciate that. Samantha, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I will. I just want to add on to some of the concerns about HB 2001 and 2003 that Matt was just hitting on. 2003, what we've already seen through some of the reports is a regional analysis of what types of housing are needed. And some of the areas, like I'm thinking of Bend and Central Oregon, the regional housing needs analysis has already showed us a very high demand for certain types of product, like single family units, duplexes, instead of a high demand for multifamily. There's certainly a need for all, but we're already seeing a demand for a certain type of product. And it's not clear how right now a local government's going to be able to make both work when 30% of their housing is going to have to be a specific type of product, but maybe their regional housing needs analysis demand is showing a higher need of a different type of product. So that's kind of one of the first pieces. And the other thing is HB 2001, which I call it the HB 2001 sword, that it cuts both ways. HB 2001 was about ensuring that middle housing products, including duplexes, would be able to be built widespread throughout the state, and that local governments wouldn't be able to put, whatever sort of regulations on it to prevent that from happening. And actually, in the rules on HB 2001, it already talks about not allowing maximum density requirements. And it talks about not allowing local governments to basically prevent putting in density requirements that would preclude duplexes. I think it goes both ways. I think that you also can't put in minimum density requirements that would also preclude housing, middle housing development in duplexes. Just like you can't have an extremely low density zone where only single family is built and no duplexes, I don't think you can have a only high density zone where only apartments are built and no duplexes. And that's kind of what these rules contemplate. And I don't see how a local government is going to be able to thread that needle. And if they do thread it, it's going to be through the narrowest of margins. And so I think what we're asking for here is, let's look at that issue. And if that does seem like it's concerned, let's change the rules now before they go into place. Instead of after the fact, instead of setting people, local governments and others up for litigation and other things like that. Let's solve the problem on the front end instead of touching the stove to see if it's hot, essentially.
Great. Thanks for that, Samantha. And gosh, we're at 12:26 and there's so many more questions in the chat and that we'd want to talk about. So again, I want to let everyone know that we're going to save the chat and we're going to do our best to answer your questions as we can. After this. But Matt, let me throw it to you real quick, and Ethan did put a link into the chat, but you're a city planner. Can you just ground us and what are we talking about when we say 25 units per acre? What types of units are we talking about?
So you might be able to get townhomes of a certain footprint into 25 units per net acre. But it'll be difficult in a lot of contexts. So you're really talking about, minimally 3-story garden apartments, 3-story walk-ups, and probably something a little bit denser. And so to Samantha's point that she made earlier, that really rules out a lot of middle housing. You're not going to get cottage clusters, which is something that we see as a very beneficial housing type we really want to promote. You're probably not going to see duplexes and triplexes. You might see quadplexes that are able to be realized vertically. But that brings up another challenge in what we have with our condo law here in the state of Oregon. Unnecessarily burdensome, difficult to deal with. Everybody hates it. Because of construction defect law, that's another challenge. So there's a huge disincentive for developers, builders to produce that product. And it smacks right up against those minimum densities. I mean, for smaller cities that are in that kind of 15 units per acre, you can do quite a bit with that. You can do cottage clusters, probably. You can do some very, very small lot, single family detached. And you can definitely do middle housing. But for the most part, single family detached housing is not going to fit in with that. Which brings up, a concern that I've had about this rule all along is, we have these CFAs and they're, in the case of Medford, it's going to be 25 units per acre, which means necessarily it's going to be, if not townhomes, it's going to be multifamily buildings. It's going to be rental because of the problems that I just talked about with the condo law and construction defect law. And that means that you're going to be concentrating people who are only going to have rental opportunities in a minimally 25 acre area. And looking at like downtown Medford, maybe that's fine. But as we're establishing additional CFAs, is that really the kind of community that we want to build? Do we want to build communities where you have people who have one set of housing needs living together and people who have a different set of housing needs living somewhere else? That was one of the great things of House Bill 2001, was the idea that we are going to maybe have neighborhoods where different kinds of people live. People with different housing needs can live next door to each other. And that's something that's important to me as we're talking about issues of social equity. We need to have neighborhoods where, you know, all sorts of different kinds of people can live next door to each other. So that's one of, I guess, one of the disappointing things that I see in the current rule.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, and a lot of questions and comments in the chat about this condo issue and the ownership issue. And I know it's been flagged by you both today and others, but I'm assuming that the passage of these rules does not come along with a condo liability reform, right? Which sounds like it's something would be needed if we wanted ownership product to be part of you know, the outcome of this. So unfortunately we're at our time, and I want to give you all sort of a last word, and I'll start by saying that in addition to following up on the questions that have been asked in the chat, we will be sending out an email next week that provides all the information that all of our members need to provide comments on these rules. So you'll see that coming from us, and we will provide that next week so that you're able to provide comments if you want to. And there have been questions in the chat just about, you know, ways that people can get involved or help, you know, at the local level and other things. So I'll just throw it to you all for any last comments that you want to make, and then we will close out. And we're sorry to keep everyone for a few extra minutes, but feel free to jump off if you need to, and we'll close out after the last words here. Matt, you want to start?
Yeah, again, thanks for the opportunity to be on the panel. And thanks to staff from DLCD for working so hard to get something together. I think, as we all would agree, we're going to need to continue to work on this. This final rule, I don't think is final, in the sense that as we implement it, we're going to run into challenges. And you know, I will assume that our partners at the state of Oregon are going to work with local communities to make sure that we can implement this, bringing the resources that we need and also some flexibility as we run into unintended consequences, which inevitably we will. So this is not the end of it, and I would encourage, you know, everyone here to submit comments, testimony when this comes before LCDC at the end of this month.
Great, thanks, Matt. Samantha, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'll just echo exactly what Matt says. There has been a tremendous amount of work. I just put a timeline together on this. And this goes back to like 2007, the amount of work that has gone into this for this agency. And it's been very difficult. And so I want to commend the department for coming today and to continuing to hear from people and listen. And like Matt said, it's not over. The rules aren't out yet. There's still opportunity to make improvements. And I just really appreciate the department for continuing to listen to everybody and keep that in mind.
Great, thanks, Samantha. Yeah, and I see our department friends here again. I just want to thank you all again so much for all the work you put into the rules, but also then taking the time to condense them and come before this group and lay them out. It's extremely complicated, but all the comments we're getting on the chat are very, you know, thankful for all of you here today coming forward and presenting this conversation in a way that was understandable to people, recognizing there needs to be more follow-up. But I think today was extremely educational because of the work that you all put in to help summarize what we're talking about here today.
If I could just say, thanks for having us. I don't know if people can hear me or not, but DLCD staff are very willing to help respond. I know there were a lot of questions in chat we didn't get to, and certainly we can help with that as well.
Great, thanks, Kevin.
You bet. Thanks for having us.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a great day. We'll see you next time.